Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I am me, and you are you, and for this time we are together and we are reading. So um, I'm glad that you could make it, and if you are all prepared, we're going to be continuing with another two chapters of Whose Body by Dorothy L. Sayers, the first of the Lord Peter Wimsey books. And we'll be reading chapters 8 and 9 today. Chapter 8 is a very short one, so I figure we could probably squeeze in both 8 and 9. And just to give you a brief recap on what's happened in our previous chapter, I'm going to bring the book out because there's actually some really funny stuff in here. And you can see I made little notes on here. First of all, the story thus far, as they are Lord Peter Wimsey and Mr. Parker, who is with Scotland Yard, are investigating the murder of a man found in a bathtub, and they are at this point they're kind of investigating this together, but the they've gone their separate paths in the course of the investigation. And Lord Peter Wimsey has gone to Salisbury to talk to a Mr. Cripplesham, and apparently he is the owner of the pince nez glasses that was found on the body. He had reported these stolen, and when they had placed an ad in the paper asking for the jeweler who had put the gold chain on the pince nez, they actually got a surprise response from Mr. Crimplesham, who says that those were in fact his glasses. So Lord Peter goes to talk to him, and they kind of have a little scene where Crimplesham doesn't believe that that Lord Peter is who he says he is until his assistant in the business kind of says, "Hey, what's Lord Peter Wimsey doing here?" And it's like, oh gosh, I better go be nice to him now because he was who he says he was. So that was that chapter. And then the following chapter, we are looking at Mr. Parker, and he is sitting in on the trial of Mr. Phipps and Miss Horrocks, the chambermaid in the house where the body was found. And at the end of that chapter, it was a long chapter, a lot of stuff happens. At the end of that chapter, Lord Peter comes back, and he is told that there is a party going on by a Lady Swaffham, and it has one of the guests is a woman there that he doesn't want to deal with and doesn't want to have anything to do with. And so he makes conversation with Lady Swaffham, who he does want to talk to. And there are several sort of like really wonderful bits in this last chapter. And one of them is that as soon as Lord Peter gets back from his trip to Salisbury, he almost immediately goes off, and it says here, "I'm off with a taxi. I can just get to the party." And Bunter, his valet, steps in front of him, it says here, blocking the way to the door with deferential firmness, and he refuses to let Lord Peter go out in those pants. Those trousers apparently are not the right trousers for the party, and it would reflect poorly on Bunter if he allowed him to go out. And so he stops him, makes him change his pants, and before he will let him go on to this party, which is like slightly wonderful. I think that's a really good scene. And then there's another really kind of nice one where at the party, and he's very late, and he makes his apologies, and he's talking to Lady Swaffham, and of course the subject comes to this detective work that he's done, and they refer to a previous adventure that we don't know about, but it's happened previously for them, about a man who was hanged for several murders. And Lord Peter says that the only reason he got caught is that he repeated himself. He kept doing the same style of murder over and over again. And Lady Swaffham says, "One demands a little originality in these days, even from murderers." And again, dark humor, but a humor nonetheless. And so he goes to the party and he has a conversation, and they talk a lot about a uh, a local celebrity, sort of, the very famous Julian Freak. He is a medical man. He teaches and does research at a local hospital and hospital slash medical school. They're all kind of connected. And he is famous because he has written several books. And so on the various neurology related topics. And so they talk about him a lot, and so he's sort of getting a little bit more of the spotlight. Meanwhile, the trial for Mr. Thipps and Gladys Horrocks, the maid, is still going on. And a lot of the last chapter was also Mr. Parker and Lord Peter Wimsey comparing notes. Now that they've all had their kind of separate adventures, they're now coming together and they're sharing their information. There's actually another scene in there that's quite good where they talk about Inspector Sugg, who, as we have seen previously, is not a very good police inspector. He kind of goes with whatever the easy choice is, regardless of whether it is whether it's factually correct or not. He just goes with what he thinks should be the way the murder happens. And there's really kind of a wonderful scene where they talk about how they know for a fact that certain things did not happen because during the trial, Inspector Sugg did not mention them. And they said, how can you be so sure? And he says, because in the scenario that Sugg has in his mind, he thinks that Gladys Horrocks' boyfriend helped get the dead body into the bathtub, into the apartment that she is made for. And so you can be sure that he tried to find every piece of evidence that would fit his conclusion. So if he did not mention it, he could not find it, because that was the one direction he was going in and the one thing he was focusing on more than anything else. And again, I thought that was very clever and very kind of a nice little bit of logic there, knowing the characters as we do. So, we're going to read a little bit. Let's start with Chapter 8. If you are ready, it goes like this. Lord Peter reached home about midnight, feeling extraordinarily wakeful and alert. Something was jigging and worrying in his brain. It felt like a hive of bees stirred up by a stick. He felt as though he were looking at a complicated riddle of which he had once been told the answer, but had forgotten it and was always on the point of remembering. Somewhere, said Lord Peter to himself, somewhere I've got the key to these two things. I know I've got it, only I can't remember what it is. Somebody said it. Perhaps I said it. I can't remember where, but I know I've got it. Go to bed, Bunter. I shall sit up a little. I'll just slip on a dressing gown. Before the fire, he sat down with his pipe in his mouth and his jazz-colored peacocks gathered about him. He traced out this line, and on that line of investigation, rivers running into the sand, they ran out from the thought of Levy, last seen at 10 o'clock on Prince of Wales Road. They ran back from the picture of the grotesque man in Mr. Thipps' bathroom. They ran over the roof and were lost in the sand. Rivers running into the sand, rivers running underground, very far down. Where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. By leaning his head down, it seemed to Lord Peter that he could hear them very faintly, lipping and gurgling somewhere in the darkness. But where? He felt quite sure that somebody had told him once, only he had forgotten. He roused himself, threw a log on the fire, and picked up a book which the indefatigable Bunter, carrying on his daily fatigues, amid the excitements of special duty had brought from the Times book club. It happened to be Sir Julian Freke's physiological basis of the conscience, which he had seen reviewed 2 days before. "This ought to send one to sleep," said Lord Peter. "If I can't leave these problems to my subconscious, I'll be as limp as a rag tomorrow." He opened the book slowly and glanced carelessly through the preface. "I wonder if it's true about Levy being ill," he thought, putting the book down. "It doesn't seem likely, and yet, dash it all, I'll take my mind off it." He read on, resolutely, for a little. "I don't suppose Mother's kept up with the Levys much," was the next importunate train of thought. "Dad always hated self-made people and wouldn't have 'em at Denver, and old Gerald keeps up the tradition. I wonder if he knew Freak well in those days. She seems to get on with Milligan. I trust Mother's judgment a good deal. She was a brick about that bazaar business. I ought to have warned her. She said something once." He pursued an elusive memory for some minutes, till it vanished altogether with a mocking flicker of the tail. He returned to his reading. Presently another thought crossed his mind, aroused by a photograph of some experiment in surgery. "If the evidence of Freak and that man Watts hadn't been so positive," he said to himself, "I should be inclined to look into the matter of those shreds of lint on the chimney." He considered this, shook his head, and read with determination. Mind and matter were one thing. That was the theme of the physiologist. Matter could erupt, as it were, into ideas. You could carve passions in the brain with a knife. You could get rid of imagination with drugs and cure an outworn convention like a disease. The knowledge of good and evil is an observed phenomenon attendant upon a certain condition of the brain cells which is removable. That was one phrase. And again, conscience in man may, in fact, be compared to the sting of a hive bee, which, so far from conducting to the welfare of its possessor, cannot function even in a single instance without occasioning its death. The survival value in each case is thus purely social, and if humanity ever passes from its present phase of social development into that of a higher individualism, as some of our philosophers had ventured to speculate, we may suppose that this interesting mental phenomenon may gradually cease to appear, just as the nerves and muscles which once controlled the movements of our ears and scalps have, in all save a few backward individuals, become atrophied and of interest only to the physiologist. "By Jove," thought Lord Peter, idly, "that's an ideal doctrine for the criminal, a man who believed that would never—" And then it happened. The thing that had been half unconsciously expecting. It happened suddenly, surely, and as unmistakably as sunrise. He remembered. Not one thing, nor another thing, nor a logical succession of things, but everything, the whole thing, perfect, complete, in all its dimensions, as it were, instantaneously, as if he stood outside the world and saw it suspended in infinitely dimensional space. He no longer needed to reason about it, or even to think about it. He knew it. There is a game in which one is presented with a jumble of letters and is required to make a word out of them. And thus, COSSSSRI. The slow way of solving the problem is to try out all permutations and combinations in turn, throwing away impossible conjunctions of letters, as SSSIRC or SCSRSO. Another way is to stare at the incoordinate elements until, by no logical process that the conscious mind can detect, or under some adventitious external stimulus, the combination SCISSORS, or scissors, presents itself with calm certainty. After that, one does not even need to arrange the letters in order. The thing is done. Even so, the scattered elements of two grotesque conundrums, flung higgledy-piggledy into Lord Peter's mind, resolve themselves, unquestioned, henceforth. A bump on the roof of the end house. Levy in a welter of cold rain talking to a prostitute in the Battersea Park Road. A single ruddy hair. Lint bandages. Inspector Sugg calling the great surgeon from the dissecting room of the hospital. Lady Levy with a nervous attack. The smell of carbolic soap. The Duchess's voice. Not really an engagement, only a sort of understanding with her father. Shares in Peruvian oil. The dark skin and curved, fleshy profile of the man in the bath. Dr. Grimbold giving evidence. In my opinion, death did not occur for several days after the blow. India rubber gloves. Even faintly, the voice of Mr. Appledore. He called on me, sir, with an anti-vivisectionist pamphlet. All these things and many others rang together and made one sound that they swung together like bells in a steeple, with the deep tenor booming through the clamor. The knowledge of good and evil is a phenomenon of the brain, and is removable. The knowledge of good and evil is removable. Lord Peter Wimsey was not a young man who habitually took himself very seriously, but this time he was frankly appalled. It's impossible, said his reason feebly. Credo quia impossibile, said his interior certainty with impervious self-satisfaction. All right, said conscience, instantly allying itself with blind faith. What are you going to do about it? Lord Peter got up and paced the room. Good Lord, he said. Good Lord! He took down Who's Who from the little shelf over the telephone and sought comfort in its pages. Freak, Sir Julian, KT, CR, 1916. GCVO, 1919. KCVO, 1917. KCB, 1918. MD, FRCP, FRCS, Doctor and Med Paris. D. Science, Cantab, Knight of Grace of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, Consulting Surgeon of St. Luke's Hospital, Battersea, born Grillingham, 16th of March, 1872. Only son of Edward Curzon Freak, Esquire, of Grill Court, Grillingham. Education, Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge College, AMS. Late member of the Advisory Board of the Army Medical Service. Publications, Some Notes on the Pathological Aspects of Genius, 1892. Statistical Contributions to the Study of Infantile Paralysis in England and Wales, 1894. Functional Disturbances of the Nervous System, 1899. Cerebrospinal Diseases, 1904. The Borderland of Insanity, 1906. An Examination into the Treatment of Pauper Lunacy in the United Kingdom, 1906. Modern Developments in Psychotherapy, a Criticism, 1910. Criminal Lunacy, 1914. The Application of Psychotherapy to the Treatment of Shell Shock, 1917. An answer to Professor Freud with a description of some experiments carried out at the base hospital at Amiens, 1919. Structural modifications accompanying the more important neuroses, 1920. Clubs, White's, Oxford and Cambridge, Alpine, etc. Recreations, chess, mountaineering, fishing. Address, 282 Harley Street and St. Luke's House, Prince of Wales Road, Battersea Park, Southwest 11. He flung the book away. Confirmation, he groaned, as if I needed it. He sat down again and buried his face in his hands. He remembered quite suddenly how years ago he had stood before the breakfast table at Denver Castle, a small, peaky boy in blue knickers with a thunderously beating heart. The family had not come down. There was a great silver urn with the spirit lamp under it, and an elaborate coffee pot boiling in a glass dome. He had twitched the corner of the tablecloth, twitched it harder, and the urn moved ponderously forward, and all the teaspoons rattled. He seized the tablecloth in a firm grip and pulled his hardest. He could feel now the delicate and awful thrill of the urn and the coffee machine and the whole of the breakfast service had crashed down in one stupendous ruin. He remembered the horrified face of the butler and the screams of a lady guest. A log broke across and sank into the fluff of white ash. A belated motor lorry rumbled past the window. Mr. Bunter, sleeping the sleep of the true and faithful servant, was aroused in the small hours by a hoarse whisper. "Bunter!" "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, sitting up and switching on the light. "Put that light out, damn you," said the voice. "Listen, over there, listen. Can't you hear it?" "It's nothing, my lord," said Mr. Bunter, hastily getting out of bed and catching hold of his master. "It's all right. You get to bed quick, and I'll fetch you a drop of bromide. Why, you're all shivering. You've been sitting up too late." "Hush! No, it's the water," said Lord Peter with chattering teeth. "It's up to their waists down there, poor devils. But listen, can't you hear it? Tap, tap, tap. They're mining us. But I don't know where. I can't hear. I can't. Listen, you. There it is again. We must find it. We must stop it. Listen. Oh, my God. I can't hear. I can't hear anything for the noise of the guns. Can't they stop the guns?" "Oh, dear," said Bunter to himself. No, it's all right, Major. Don't you worry." "But I hear it," protested Peter. "So do I," said Bunter stoutly. "Very good hearing, too, my lord. That's our own sappers at work in the communication trench. Don't you fret about that, sir." Lord Peter grasped his wrist with a feverish hand. "Our own sappers?" he said. "Sure of that?" "Certain of it," said Mr. Bunter, cheerfully. "They'll bring down the tower," said Lord Peter. "To be sure they will," said Mr. Bunter, "and very nice, too. You just come and lay down a bit, sir. They've come to take over this section. You're sure it's safe to leave it?" said Lord Peter. Safe as houses, sir," said Mr. Bunter, tucking his master's arm under his and walking him off to his bedroom. Lord Peter allowed himself to be dosed and put to bed without further resistance. Mr. Bunter, looking singularly un-Bunter-like in striped pajamas, with his stiff black hair ruffled about his head, sat grimly watching the younger man's sharp cheekbones and the purple stains under his eyes. "Thought he'd had the last of these attacks," he said. "Been overdoing of himself. Asleep?" He peered at him anxiously. An affectionate note crept into his voice. "Bloody little fool. said Sergeant Bunter. Chapter 9. Mr. Parker, summoned the next morning to 110 Piccadilly, arrived to find the Dowager Duchess in possession. She greeted him charmingly. "I'm going to take this silly boy down to Denver for the weekend," she said, indicating Peter, who was writing and only acknowledged his friend's entrance with a brief nod. "He's been doing too much, running about to Salisbury and places up until all hours of the night. You really shouldn't encourage him, Mr. Parker. It's very naughty of you, waking poor Bunter up in the middle of the night with scares about Germans, as if that wasn't all over years ago, and he hasn't had an attack for ages, but there. Nerves are such funny things, and Peter always did have nightmares when he was quite a little boy. Though very often, of course, it was only a little pill he wanted. But he was so dreadfully bad in 1918, and I suppose we can't expect to forget all about a great war in a year or two, and really, I ought to be very thankful with both my boys safe. Still, I think a little peace and quiet at Denver won't do him any harm." "Sorry you've been having a bad turn, old man," said Parker, vaguely sympathetic. "You're looking a bit seedy." "Charles," said Lord Peter, in a voice entirely void of expression, "I'm going away for a couple of days because I can be no use to you in London. What has got to be done for the moment can be much better done by you than by me. I want you to take this." He folded up his writing and placed it in an envelope. "To Scotland Yard immediately, and get it sent out to all the workhouses, infirmaries, police stations, YMCAs, and so on in London. It's a description of Thipps's corpse, as he was before he was shaved and cleaned up. I want to know whether any man answering to that description has been taken in anywhere, alive or dead, during the last fortnight. You will see Sir Andrew Mackenzie personally, and get the paper sent out at once by his authority. You will tell him that you have solved the problems of the Levy murder and the Battersea mystery." Mr. Parker made an astonished noise, to which his friend paid no attention. "And you will ask him to have men in readiness with a warrant to arrest a very dangerous and important criminal at any moment on your information. When the replies to this paper come in, you will search for any mention of St. Luke's Hospital or of any person connected with St. Luke's Hospital, and you will send for me at once. Meanwhile, you will scrape acquaintance, I don't care how, with one of the students at St. Luke's. Don't march in there blowing about murders and police warrants, or you may find yourself in Queer Street. I shall come up to town as soon as I hear from you, and I shall expect to find a nice, ingenious Sawbones here to meet me." He grinned faintly. "Do you mean you've got to the bottom of this thing?" asked Parker. "Yes, I may be wrong. I hope I am, but I know I'm not." "You won't tell me?" "Do you know," said Peter, "honestly, I'd rather not. I say I may be wrong, and I feel as if I'd libeled the Archbishop of Canterbury." "Well, tell me, is it a one mystery or two?" "One." "You talked of the Levy murder. Is Levy dead?" "Good God, yes," said Peter with a strong shudder. The Duchess looked up from where she was reading the Tatler. "Peter," she said, "is that your ague coming up again? Whatever you two are chattering about, you'd better stop at once if it excites you. Besides, it's about time to be off." "All right, Mother," said Peter. He turned to Bunter, standing respectfully in the door with an overcoat and suitcase. "You understand what you have to do, don't you?" he said. "Perfectly. Thank you, my lord. The car is just arriving, your grace." "With Mrs. Thipps inside it," said the with Mrs. Thips inside it, said the Duchess. She'll be delighted to see you again, Peter. You remind her so of Mr. Thips. Good morning, Bunter. Good morning, Your Grace. Parker accompanied them downstairs. When they had gone, he looked blankly at the paper in his hand. Then, remembering that it was Saturday and there was need for haste, he hailed a taxi. Scotland Yard, he cried. Tuesday morning saw Lord Peter and a man in a velveteen jacket swishing merrily through 7 acres of turnip tops, streaked yellow with early frosts. A little way ahead, a sinuous undercurrent of excitement among the leaves proclaimed the unseen yet ever near presence of one of the Duke of Denver's setter pups. Presently a partridge flew up with a noise like a police rattle, and Lord Peter accounted for it very creditably for a man who, a few nights before, had been listening to imaginary German sappers. The setter bounded foolishly through the turnips and fetched back the dead bird. Good dog, said Lord Peter. Encouraged by this, the dog gave a sudden ridiculous gambol and barked, its ear tossed inside out over his head. Heel, said the man in velveteen violently. The animal sidled up, ashamed. Fool of a dog, that, said the man in velveteen. Can't keep quiet. Too nervous, my lord. One of old Black Lass's pups. Dear me, said Peter. Is the old dog still going? No, my lord, we had to put her away in the spring. Peter nodded. He always proclaimed that he hated the country and was thankful to have nothing to do with the family's secrets. But this morning he enjoyed the crisp air and the wet leaves washing darkly over his polished boots. At Denver, things moved in an orderly way. No one died sudden and violent deaths, except aged setters, and partridges, to be sure. He sniffed up the autumn smell with appreciation. There was a letter in his pocket which had come by morning post, but he did not intend to read it just yet. Parker had not wired. There was no hurry. He read it in the smoking room after lunch. His brother was there, dozing over the Times. Good, clean Englishman, sturdy and conventional, rather like Henry VIII in his youth. Gerald, 16th Duke of Denver. The Duke considered his cadet rather degenerate and not quite good form. He disliked his taste for police court news. The letter was from Mr. Bunter. 110 Piccadilly. My lord, I write. Mr. Bunter had been carefully educated and knew that nothing was more vulgar than a careful avoidance of beginning a letter with the first person singular. As your lordship directed to inform you of the result of my investigations. I experienced no difficulty in becoming acquainted with Sir Julian Freke's manservant. He belongs to the same club as the Honorable Frederick Arbuthnot's man, who is a friend of mine, and was very willing to introduce me. He took me to the club yesterday, Sunday, evening, and we dined with the man, whose name is John Cummings, and afterwards I invited Cummings to drink and a cigar in the flat. Your lordship will excuse me doing this, knowing that it is not my habit, but it has always been my experience that the best way to gain a man's confidence is to let him suppose that one takes advantage of one's employer. I always suspected Bunter of being a student of human nature, commented Lord Peter. I gave him the best old port. The deuce you did, said Lord Peter, having heard you and Mr. Arbuthnot talk over it. Huh, said Lord Peter. Its effects were quite equal to my expectations as regards the principal matter in hand, but I very much regret to state that the man had so little understanding of what was offered to him that he smoked a cigar with it, one of your lordship's Villars. You will understand that I make no comment on this at the time, but your lordship will sympathize with my feelings. May I take this opportunity of expressing my grateful appreciation of your lordship's excellent taste in food, drink, and dress. It is, if I may say so, more than a pleasure. It is an education to valet and bottle your lordship. Lord Peter bowed his head gravely. What on earth are you doing, Peter? Sitting there, nodding and grinning like what you may call it, demanded the Duke, coming suddenly out of his snooze. Someone's writing pretty things to you, what? Charming things, said Lord Peter. The Duke eyed him doubtfully. Hope to goodness you don't go and marry a chorus beauty, he muttered inwardly, and returned to the Times. Over dinner I had set myself to discover Cummings' tastes, and found them to run in the direction of a music-hall stage. During his first glass I drew him out in this direction, your lordship having kindly given me opportunities of seeing every performance in London. I spoke more freely than I should consider becoming in an ordinary way in order to make myself pleasant to him. I may say that his views on women and the stage were much as I should have expected from a man who would smoke with your lordship's port. With the second glass, I introduce the subject of your lordship's inquiries. In order to save time, I will write our conversation in the form of a dialogue, as clearly as possible as it actually took place. Cummings. You seem to get many opportunities of seeing a bit of life, Mr. Bunter. Bunter. One can always make opportunities if one knows how. Cummings. It's very easy for you to talk, Mr. Bunter. You're not married, for one thing. I know better than that, Mr. Cummings. Cummings. So do I, now, when it's too late. He sighed heavily, and I filled up his glass. Bunter. Does Mrs. Cummings live with you at Battersea? Cummings. Yes, her and me, we do for my governor. Such a life. Not but what there's a char comes in by the day. But what's a char? I can tell you it's dull all by ourselves in that damned Battersea suburb. Bunter. Not very convenient for the halls, of course. Cummings. I believe you. It's all right for you here in Piccadilly. Right on the spot, as you may say. But I dare say your governor's often out all night, eh? Bunter. Oh, frequently, Mr. Cummings. Cummings. And I dare say you take the opportunity to slip off yourself every so often, eh? Bunter. Well, what do you think, Mr. Cummings? Cummings. That's it. There you are. But what's a man to do with a nagging fool of a wife and a blasted scientific doctor for a governor, as sits up all night cutting up dead bodies and experimenting with frogs? Bunter. Surely he goes out sometimes. Cummings. Not often, and always back before 12. And the way he goes on, if he rings the bell and you ain't there, I give you my word, Mr. Bunter. Bunter. Temper? Cummings. No, but looking through you, nasty-like, as if you were on the operating table of his, and he was going to cut you up. Nothing a man could rightly complain of, you understand. Mr. Bunter, just nasty looks. Not but what I will say, he's very correct. Apologizes if he's been inconsiderate, but what's the good of that when he's been gone and lost you your night's rest? Bunter. How does he do that? Keep you up late, you mean? Cummings. Not him, far from it. House locked up and household to bed at 10:30. That's his little rule, but what I'm glad enough to go as a rule, but it's that dreary. Still, when I do go to bed, I like to go to sleep. Bunter. What does he do? Walk about the house? Cummings. Doesn't he? All night, and in and out of the private door to the hospital. Bunter. You don't mean to say Mr. Cummings, a great specialist like Sir Julian Freke, does night work at the hospital? Cummings. No, no, he does his own work, research work, as you might say. Cuts people up. They say he's very clever. Could take you or me to pieces like a clock, Mr. Bunter, and put us together again. Bunter. Do you sleep in the basement, then, to hear him so plain? Cummings. No, our bedroom's at the top, but Lord, what's that? He'll bang the door so you can hear him all over the house. Bunter. Many's the time I've had to speak to Lord Peter about that, and talking all night, and baths. Cummings. Baths? You may well say that, Mr. Bunter. Baths? Me and my wife sleep next to the cistern room. Noise fit to wake the dead. All hours. When do you think he chose to have a bath? No later last Monday night. Mr. Bunter. Bunter. I've known them to do it at 2 in the morning, Mr. Cummings. Cummings. Have you now? Well, this was at 3. 3 o'clock in the morning. We was waked up. I give you my word. Bunter. You don't say so, Mr. Cummings. Cummings. He cuts up diseases, you see, Mr. Bunter, and then he don't like to go to bed till he's washed the bacilluses off, if you understand me. Very natural, too, I dare say. But what I say is, the middle of the night's no time for a gentleman to be occupying his mind with diseases. Bunter. These great men have their own way of doing things. Cummings. Well, all I can say is it isn't my way. I could believe that, your lordship. Cummings has no signs of greatness about him, and his trousers are not what I would wish to see in a man of his profession. Bunter. Is he habitually late as that, Mr. Cummings? Cummings. Well, no, Mr. Bunter, I will say not as a general rule. He apologized, too, in the morning, and said he would have the cistern seen to, and very necessary, in my opinion, for the air gets into the pipes, and the groaning and screeching as goes on is something awful. Just like Niagara, if you follow me, Mr. Bunter. I give you my word. Bunter. Well, that's as it should be, Mr. Cummings. One can put up with a great deal from a gentleman that has the manners to apologize, and, of course, sometimes they can't help themselves. A visitor will come in unexpectedly and keep them late, perhaps. Cummings. True enough, Mr. Bunter. Now I come to think of it, there was a gentleman come in on Monday evening. Not that he came in late, but he stayed about an hour and may have put Sir Julian behindhand. Bunter. Very likely. Let me give you some more port, Mr. Cummings, or a little of Lord Peter's old brandy. Cummings. A little of the brandy, thank you, Mr. Bunter. I suppose you have the run of the cellar here. He winked at me. Trust me for that, I said, and I fetched him the Napoleon. I assure you, your lordship, it went to my heart to pour it out for a man like that. However, seeing we had got on the right track, I felt it wouldn't be wasted. I'm sure I wish it was always gentlemen that come here at night, I said. Your lordship will excuse me, I am sure, making such a suggestion. Good God, said Lord Peter, I wish Bunter was less thorough in his methods. Cummings. Oh, he's that sort, his lordship is, he. He chuckled and poked me. I suppress a portion of his conversation here, which could not fail to be as offensive to your lordship as it was to myself. He went on. No, it's none of that with Sir Julian. Very few visitors at night, and always gentlemen, and going early as a rule, like the one I mentioned. Bunter. Just as well. There's nothing I find more wearisome, Mr. Cummings, than sitting up to see visitors out. Cummings. Oh, I didn't see this one out. Sir Julian let him out himself at 10 o'clock, or thereabouts. I heard the gentleman shout, "Good night," and off he goes. Bunter. Does Sir Julian always do that? Cummings. Well, that depends. If he sees visitors downstairs, he lets them out himself. If he sees them upstairs in the library, he rings for me. Bunter. This was a downstairs visitor, then? Cummings. Oh, yes, Sir Julian opened the door to him, I remember. He happened to be working in the hall, though, now I come to think of it, they went up to the library afterwards. That's funny. I know they did because I happened to go up to the hall with Coles, and I heard them upstairs. Besides, Sir Julian rang for me in the library a few minutes later. Still, anyway, we heard him go at 10, or it may have been a bit before. He hadn't only stayed about 3/4 of an hour. However, as I was saying, there was Sir Julian banging in and out of the private door all night, and a bath at 3 in the morning, and up again for breakfast at 8. It beats me. If I had all his money, curse me if I'd go poking about with dead men in the middle of the night. I'd find something better to do with my time, eh, Mr. Bunter? I need not repeat any more of his conversation, as it became unpleasant and incoherent. And I could not bring him back to the events of Monday night. I was unable to get rid of him until 3. He cried on my neck, and said I was the bird, and you were the governor for him. He said that Sir Julian would be greatly annoyed with him for coming home so late, but Sunday night was his night out, and if anything was said about it, he would give notice. I think he will be ill-advised to do so, as I feel he is not a man I would conscientiously recommend if I were in Sir Julian Freke's place. I noticed that his boot heels were slightly worn down. I should wish to add, as a tribute to the great merits of your lordship's cellar, that, although I was obliged to drink a somewhat large quantity of both the Cockburn 68 and the 1800 Napoleon, I feel no headache or other ill effects this morning. Trusting that your lordship is deriving real benefit from the country air, and that little information I have been able to obtain will prove satisfactory, I remain, with respectful duty to all the family, obediently yours, Mervyn Butler. You know, said Lord Peter thoughtfully to himself, I sometimes think Mervyn Bunter's pulling my leg. What is it, Soames? A telegraph, my lord. Parker, said Lord Peter, opening it. It said, description recognized, Chelsea workhouse, unknown vagrant, injured street accident, Wednesday week. Died workhouse Monday. Delivered St. Luke's same evening by order Freak. Much puzzled, Parker. Hooray, said Lord Peter, suddenly sparkling. I'm glad I've puzzled Parker. Gives me confidence in myself. Makes me feel like Sherlock Holmes. Perfectly simple, Watson. Dash it all, though. This is a beastly business. Still, it's puzzled Parker. What's the matter? Asked the Duke, getting up and yawning. Marching orders, said Peter. Back to town. Many thanks for your hospitality, old bird. I'm feeling no end better. Ready to tackle Professor Moriarty or Leon Kestrel or any of them. I do wish you'd keep out of the police courts, grumbled the Duke. It makes it so dashed awkward for me having a brother making himself conspicuous. Sorry, Gerald, said the other. I know I'm a beastly blot on the scutcheon. Why can't you marry and settle down and live quietly doing something useful? Said the Duke, unappeased. Because that was a washout, as you perfectly well know, said Peter. Besides, he added cheerfully, I'm being no end useful. You may come to want me yourself, you never know. When anybody comes blackmailing you, Gerald, or your first deserted wife turns up unexpectedly from the West Indies, you'll realize the pull of having a private detective in the family. Delicate private business arranged with tact and discretion, investigations undertaken Divorce evidence, a specialty. Every guarantee. Come now. Ass, said Lord Denver, throwing the newspaper violently into his armchair. When do you want the car? Almost at once. I say, Jerry, I'm taking mother up with me. Why should she be mixed up in it? Well, I want your help. I call it most unsuitable, said the Duke. The Dowager Duchess, however, made no objection. I used to know her quite well, she said, when she was Christine Ford. Why, dear? Because, said Lord Peter, there's a terrible piece of news to be broken to her about her husband. Is he dead, dear? Yes, and she will have to come and identify him. Poor Christine. Under very revolting circumstances, Mother. I'll come with you, dear. Thank you, Mother. You're a brick. Do you mind getting your things on straight away and coming up with me? I'll tell you about it in the car. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 9, as we read chapter 8 and 9. So, a very interesting part that we have not seen in previous readings, that Lord Peter Wimsey suffers from a little PTSD, what they called shell shock back in the time the story was written, and that we have seen evidence of the nightmares that he has, that he is still back fighting in the Great War, and Bunter, who is his sergeant, you can see that this is how they met, that they met in the service, and that they have remained together after World War One, as Bunter has gone into service to help his lordship. And so not only are they now working together, that Lord Peter has hired Bunter, but now we know that previously they were together and fighting World War One. So very interesting, I think, a very good a bit of character development, and now we see that things are in motion, and we are heading on down to the latter half of the book. And so thank you very much for joining me for today's live reading of chapters 8 and 9. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you again on Friday at 4 p.m. I hope you can join me. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.